the sacraments of commitment, but in a sense, every sacrament that we receive is a sacrament of commitment. We are promising something to God as we have those sacraments. But these two sacraments are the sacraments of marriage and ordination, holy orders. So they are, in some respects, very similar to some of the other sacraments. They involve a commitment to God, solemn vows, and so that's what they have kind of share in common. We'll also, if we have some time, go over a little bit of the church hierarchy and some of the mysteries of the formal church and all of that, which can be quite confusing if you're exploring the Catholic faith for the first time.
And Phil, if we don't have time, I'll just do a handout of.
Some of this in their handouts, although
okay.
some of that print's pretty fine. So.
Great. Okay.
Matrimony, or the sacrament of marriage, is really kind of the embodiment of a lot of what the Catholic Church is about. Many of the more controversial, well, not to us they're not controversial, but in the world that we live in, many of the positions of the Church are a desire of the Church to go back to the way things were meant to be. And so when we talk about matrimony, even Jesus, when the scribes and the Pharisees would come to him and say, what do you think about divorce? And what do you think about marriage? And Jesus would say, well, Moses said it was okay, but he only did that because you guys were so stubborn and the way you treated one another. And so he said, okay, but really you should go back to the very beginning and remember what it was like at the very beginning when the man and the woman were joined by God and God was part of their lives. I mean, it talks in Genesis about the man and woman walking through the garden with God in their presence. And so a very special relationship. And he made them in his image, and he made them in each other's image in a special way, but also different. So we always look at some of the origins of the sacraments. And so it says, in the divine image he created them, male and female, he created them, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, so close together in their relationship that in some ways they're inseparable from one another. And so those are the origins and the beginnings of the sacrament. And of course, like every other thing that we try to undertake as human beings, we are not perfect. And so we kind of messed up at the very beginning. And you've had theology of the body.
Yes.
So some of the origins of theology of the body come from this scripture. After the fall, I hid myself because I was naked. So suddenly what was normal, what was good, what was right, became not so good, not so normal, not so right. But not from God's perspective, but from our perspective. And so that's why they hid each other and hid from God in their nakedness. Another Old Testament, do not let anyone be faithless to the wife of his youth. And that's, again, part of our society is the glamour society. And as we get a little older and things start to wrinkle up and sag a little bit, suddenly we lose that, many lose that commitment to each other. And if that commitment was only made physically, but not spiritually with God, you can see, well, why that might happen. What God has joined together, let no one separate. That comes from Matthew. That comes from that discussion I mentioned with Jesus, with the scribes about going back to the beginning. And one thing I might mention about that is at the time of Jesus, divorce that was permitted really was a one-sided affair. It was really primarily the male part of the couple who initiated, he initiated divorce, and it was really rather simple. He could just write a note and say, that wife is not my wife anymore. And of course in those days, if a woman were excluded from the household, if she had no family, she was going to be in dire straits because there would be nobody to take care of her. And essentially, she had probably two choices: to be a beggar or to sell herself. Those were her choices. So Jesus saw that, and he was very upset with that idea. And so divorce in that day was quite different than it is today. And then, as usual, Jesus always raises the bar. So he's saying that anyone who looks at another woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so he's just trying to emphasize that pledge, that covenant between the couple and God, that they are focused on God, focused on each other. And guys, think this through. Using that definition, we can even commit adultery with our own wives if we are only using her rather than being a part of her life and giving of ourselves. So that kind of can freak you out a little bit. So we do tend to, in our society, we as Catholics divide marriage into two categories. One is civil marriage and the other is sacramental marriage. And sacramental marriage differs from civil marriage in that it is a covenant. So as I said earlier, a real marriage, a sacramental marriage, is a man and a woman and God. God is part of that marriage. And so it reflects that relationship with God in many ways. So as a married couple, you share in creation, and your love is a self-sacrificing love. That's what it means when it says we're in the image of God, that we are able to love in a self-sacrificing way. So other things that we share with God's love is that our sacramental marriage is meant to be lifelong and faithful union. We choose one another for the mutual sharing of our life and love. It's open to children, and it's modeled after God's ever faithful love for his people. So a very close reflection of our relationship with God is also our relationship with our spouse. In the Catholic tradition, or in the Catholic faith, marriage, the impact of marriage is it binds couples to the profession of faith. One party must be a member of the church. Ordained ministers are not allowed to go out and marry non-Catholics to each other, but you can marry a Catholic to a non-Catholic. The lasting relationship that evangelizes the community and its offspring. So by the very act of creating as God creates, we are called upon to send forth children that also spread the good news and also call people to that relationship with God. Teaches the community to the meaning and reality of commitment. So many times when we meet with a young couple or an old couple, when we meet with a couple that are considering marriage, we talk a little bit about their own families and their origins, and it's because we're looking for did they have good role models of commitment? I think one of the things that parents always worry about is because we always see as we raise our children, we only see that long process of them learning what true commitment is. And it was easy for us to say, but harder to enforce. But I used to tell my kids, I don't care, most parts, I would not discourage them from joining something if they wanted to join something, but I would ask them to be committed about it. So I don't want you to go to the first scout meeting and then come home the next day and say, well, I quit. I didn't like it. So I asked them to give a good try, at least, to try and learn some commitment. So you may have had that experience, and you may have had that yourself. You're coming here every Sunday is a commitment.
And this is a faithful class, too, which is a great thing.
Good, that's what we're looking for. So, and then remember that parties are all equal in a marriage, including God. Very important, because before there was women's lib, God had women's lib. I mean, he just saw that they created the man and the woman in his image, both of them in his image, and so he expects that they share everything, and that they are partners. Unfortunately, some of the scripture, the way it's translated, it makes a big difference. That one word can make a big difference, and so there's somewhere in versions of Genesis that refers to the woman as the helpmate of Adam. And yeah, well, she is the helpmate, but that doesn't mean she's the maid. so it's all about equal in there. Not the same, but equal. So I'm not going to dwell on theology of the body other than to say it looks at the sexual relationship of a man and a woman as a bonding, not just a means of creating children, but as a bonding experience, bringing them into intimacy. And it's a celebration of life and fruitfulness. Now I would say, without jumping ahead, maybe I need to. I would say that, remember this, some couples eventually find that they're not able to have children, but their marriages are always fruitful. They're not necessarily fruitful in terms of having children, but they're fruitful in terms of being a model to the community of a relationship between a man and a woman, a fruitful relationship where God is part of their marriage. So that stands as this model, and that has very fruitful benefits. And so many of you that might be here, it may very well be because some couple somewhere invited you in. It may not be your future spouse, if that's what you're here for. It may be that a couple in church that knew you somehow, brought you in. So it's always the possibility of marriage being fruitful beyond the having children. So I spent 10 minutes on marriage and all the benefits and good things about marriage and what it means, and then we should jump right into annulment. Actually, I'm going to revise these slides to say, instead of annulment of consent, going to be consent and freedom to marry. And so we'll look at it more from a positive standpoint. So there are certain things out there that, well, I'll back up a step. So we said earlier that we have sacramental marriage and we have civil marriage. In our country that we live in, you have to have the civil marriage recorded, and then the sacramental marriage occurs after the civil marriage is recorded, and is it kind of mixed in with it because the minister who celebrates the sacramental marriage has to sign the civil marriage license as well, so they're connected that way. And so many of the factors that go into a valid marriage, not just sacramentally but legally, are shared by the church and by the government. So there is an age requirement. Under that age in the Catholic Church, if you're under 18, you're supposed to have the consent of your parents. In the state of Ohio, I think they look at 16 as the age of consent. There are a few states that even go as low as 14. But that's kind of unusual. You have to be potent. In other words, you have to have the potential to bring forth life. And that is a whole other ballgame that I could spend an hour talking about. But in the science that we have available to us, it would be very unusual for anybody to deny marriage just because they were supposedly not potent. Because science is constantly coming forth with new discoveries, so not something we dwell on too much. You can't currently already be married, so we don't allow people in the country to have more than one wife at a time. And you also may not have made a vow, so in the Catholic Church, they would say that if you are already if you're a clergy or if you're a religious and have made a spiritual vow, then you would not be allowed to marry. Both parties don't have to be Catholic, but but if one of the parties is unbaptized, then the church says, well, you need to get at least a more formal permission, but you can still marry an unbaptized person. That happens. We've had that happen here. Not unusual. And so you get permission, and usually that permission comes from the bishop. So we say that people need to be free to marry, so that means they can't be kidnapped, and that seems like that's kind of weird. But, you know, in the days of old when the knights would rush up and sweep a woman and take off with her and come back later and say, well, we're married, that was, no, you can't do that. So actually that had more validity back then, but even today we see these bizarre occurrences where women are kidnapped or people are kidnapped, and then 10 years later they reappear and they've got 4 kids and they were held captive for, you know, that one case in Cleveland was really bizarre. So it does happen. Killing someone, what that refers to is just basically that, like sort of like David and Bathsheba, that he sent Bathsheba's husband out into the essentially basically had him killed, and so that she was free to marry him. And that, if you look at a lot of B movies, there's probably a lot of those that have that theme in it, that somebody is planning the death of a spouse so that they can be free to marry someone else. And then direct family members or adoption. So in the state of Ohio, I believe it's second cousin and closer than second cousin are not legally allowed to marry. And also adoption. So if I adopt a child and she grows up with my own son, let's say it's a girl, and they grow up together, and they decided they want to get married, not allowed. Because she is perceived as a full part of that family. Personally, I think, and I don't know if it's personal or not, but I think what they're trying to get at there is to avoid any kind of abuse that might occur as a child is adopted and raised within a family, that something's not going on there that shouldn't be. Other issues would be psychic dysfunctions. That's not like they're connected to a medium somewhere. I think that is meant to be psychiatric dysfunctions. But you have to be knowledgeable and willing, have the wherewithal to make a decision, to make a commitment. And so that's one of the grounds for marriage. Ignorance of what marriage is, and in particular the Marriage Act, that sounds also quite bizarre in our day and age, since you just need to turn on the TV to see what that's all about. But it still could be claimed as a grounds that I didn't know what this was all about. Mom never talked to me or what have you. So that's one of them. Error of identity or quality. John meets Mary and he tells her that he's got $20 million in the bank and a couple of homes around the country, and paints this picture, and then she marries him and finds out he doesn't have 2 pennies to rub together. That would be presenting himself as someone who he's not. So legally, she would be entitled to an annulment. When you get into annulments within the church, that would be more extended over things like spiritual things. So if John says that he is a practicing Catholic and that he professes all of the things that Catholics profess, and then they get married and she finds out he really isn't that, which you can see that would be more subjective as to exactly who this guy is, and the fact that he's not practicing his faith. I had one of the pre-marriage documents you sign has the person who is not Catholic. Actually, it's the person who is Catholic. They sign a statement basically saying that my spouse, my future spouse, has agreed to allow me to practice my faith, and I consent in that regard. And so they're basically saying that they will respect the faith of the person they're about to marry. So that's a different kind of quality. Withholding a vital element, things like faithfulness, that is also grounds for annulment. And then conditional requirements. And these are not often stated by a couple, but they are sometimes a surprise in the marriage. They are sometimes a hidden agenda in the marriage, but they do exist. So it may be that one of the couple has this idea of what marriage is going to be like, and that might include that they're going to have this beautiful home by the time they're 30, and so as they approach that age, it may be that they don't have the beautiful home, and so one of the couple is like, I'm getting out of this marriage. This is not what I planned on. Well, that is it can be grounds for annulment. In a more formal sense, the church discourages prenuptial agreements. The church will recognize agreements, especially between older adults who may be making a prenuptial arrangement that their assets be inherited by their former family. And that is not uncommon, and so the church would not have a problem with that. But if a young couple starts out and maybe the one member of the party is extremely wealthy, the other one is not, and they say, well, you need to sign this agreement that if we get a divorce, you're not going to get a hold of my money, then that is looked at as, well, you're already going into the relationship as if it's not going to be a sacramental marriage, and therefore we don't allow that. You better get it straightened out. Any questions about sacramental matrimony? If we look at it, we have basically two kinds of ceremonies in the church now. We have matrimony with or without a mass. With a mass they usually are both Catholic. Without a mass, one party is probably not Catholic, and we do that partly because if John is not Catholic and most of his relatives that are going to be there at the mass are not Catholic, then it's kind of an area of sensitivity that because communion is the central part of the mass, then automatically a large part of the people attending will not be invited forward for communion, which doesn't seem right. So we do a sacrament, and we do a sacrament. That's a good word. I just invented that.
Nice.
We do a ceremony. And most of those marriages between non-Catholic and Catholic, that's an area where I can help Father out quite a bit, so I often do those marriages. And the basic ceremony is identical, it's just that we don't have the consecration and distribution of communion. So there are opening prayer, the readings, all the same, and then the vows are exchanged. And so all of that is identical to what would occur within the Mass.
Deacon Phil, can you talk a little bit about the premarital counseling and your experiences
Sure.
with that?
I'm looking around here and I'm trying to remember. I don't know that any of you, you took focus with me. My wife and I have had a ministry for years now. And my ministry as a deacon is to help couples prepare for their marriage. Not for their wedding, well, sometimes that slips out, but that's part of it, but really it's more or less to prepare for your marriage. And part of that is a program, probably the heart of the program, as far as I'm concerned, is called Focus, in which the couple complete a survey of statements, a couple, I don't know about a couple hundred, but a lot of statements that are something to this effect. We have discussed and agreed on the role each of us will play in our marriage. And then they say, I agree with that, or we disagree with that, or we're not certain. And there are many, many statements like that, some of them having to do with communication, some with problem solving, some with finance, some with sexual relationships, a lot of them with faith, spiritual kind of relationship. And then we send those results in, they come back, and then we can see a profile of all those things that they agreed on with what we would call a preferred response, and those they do not. And so a lot of discussion then occurs about, well, and so why do we do that? Well, two leading causes of divorce are finance and sex. And so we want to make sure that the couple, before they get started, is prepared to be very communicative and understanding of those two areas especially, but a lot of other areas, and so that's why there's a lot of communication statements in there. So there's that program. Some churches use other tools to do that, but we're choosing to use that one here. In addition to that, there's a series of meetings that we have with the couple where we actually get into some of this stuff, some basic things like determining are they free to marry. So we kind of do that concurrently. And then towards the end of the meetings, they will usually have a class in natural family planning, which I think they've had that
We talked about
discussion.
that.
And then they take an engaged couple retreat, which is kind of a cool thing because they go to a retreat, usually in the Toledo area, and they learn a lot more about theology of the body, and then they learn a lot about what I've talked about here. But those retreats are a couple days, and they do it in the context of having usually at least two married couples facilitate that, and then they have the other engaged couples to kind of exchange notes with, if you will. And so it's usually a pretty beneficial thing for the couple to attend that. And then the last meeting with the clergy is usually to go over the ceremony itself and get their preferences for readings and things like that. So that's kind of the format we use. It's not too mysterious.
Okay. Emily and Alex, does that sound like what you guys have started with your priest?
Yeah, we did the married and engagement couple thing at my church, and we actually filled out the survey questions. Ours isn't called Focus, but
yeah, there's several different
yeah.
ones.
So I mean, it was really eye-opening. Kind of, it was like a lot. It was like 200 questions.
Yeah.
But it was like things I didn't even think about.
Well, that's what we usually find out. Most young couples aren't thinking about some of these, and probably if Jean and I took the survey, we'd be like, after all these years of marriage, I'm not sure what that means either. But yeah, I think it's kind of, and then within that context, sometimes they have statements about, have you discussed how you will discipline your children? We haven't even talked about children yet, but again, it's, you don't want to marry somebody and then when the children come along, suddenly find out that dad is a strict disciplinarian that wants to go back to corporal punishment, or whatever you might choose, or dad says, well, I'll tell these children what they should do, but if they don't, then mom is going to take care of it. that was kind of what went on in my family. Mom was the enforcer, so to speak. Unless it was really bad, then she'd just say, wait till your father gets home, and he would have to be the enforcer. But there are things like that, or even how many children, because natural family planning even accepts the idea that most people are not going to want 12 children like they did in the old days to help with the farm and all that stuff. So you don't want to get married and then find out he wants 12 kids and I only want 2 or 3. So those things are, they seem like evident things that you should know, but it's in the swirl of romance, sometimes those things aren't thought about. It's just this wonderful relationship we're in, and all those hard practical things are kind of left to the side. So I think they're a good thing. So not surprised that you got them surprised. It's better to have them now than after you're married.
Could you also talk about what happens after you get an annulment and we have one person in the class that's getting an annulment is already married. So then what?
Yeah, people come to annulment with a lot of different backgrounds and obviously and circumstances, and so the annulment process ideally occurs before you remarry, and in fact it's a couple of statements on the questionnaire they're given. It's going to state are you married or are you engaged even, and if you respond that you're engaged, then they really strongly encourage you, don't get married until after we decide on this annulment. But initially the person looking will meet with Father Tom, sometimes myself, but most often with Father Tom. He'll have a discussion, and then if they would like to proceed, then he contacts me, and I am, I'm looking for the word now. I'm basically a facilitator for the annulment process here in the parish. So I'm the one that sits down and we kind of go through the nuts and bolts of what they need to do, and the heart of which is almost reviewing all this, because in the Catholic tradition, first of all, to get an annulment you have to be divorced. And so it's always kind of weird that the society we live in says the Catholics don't allow or don't recognize divorce. We don't do divorces, but we do recognize divorces. And the context of that is that divorce to the Catholic Church represents the fact that it probably is unlikely that this couple is going to reconcile. Because up until the divorce, the Church's focus is supposed to be on helping couples reconcile whatever they're going through, and perhaps getting back together. But once they come for annulment, then we will ask right away, when was your divorce, and get into that. And then we begin this process, which is basically reviewing their relationship before they got married and while they were married. Because in the context of sacramental marriage, we say that at the moment of exchange of vows, that you are having this commitment between yourselves and God. And so if you're going to be breaking that commitment between yourselves and God, we want to know what was wrong at the time of the ceremony, at the time of the marriage. And most times if you see what's going on during the marriage, you can trace that back to some things that occurred before the marriage. So fidelity is a big thing in terms of grounds. And if somebody's unfaithful in their marriage, you may see patterns of unfaithfulness, not necessarily physical unfaithfulness, but unfaithfulness early on in their lives. Maybe they didn't have a good role model. Maybe their parents were divorced. They never formed a strong bond. Maybe as they grew up, they had multiple relationships with other young people, and so they don't really understand the sanctity of what fidelity is all about. So that is where we're kind of putting their history together and then sitting down and saying, okay, here's what we think the grounds might be for the annulment of that particular marriage. There are a lot of other factors that come in that complicate things sometimes, but that's primarily. And then once that's all done, we send all this paperwork to the Diocese of Toledo. They have a tribunal up there which reviews the paperwork, usually contacts or tries to contact the former spouse, the ex-spouse, and invites them if they want to participate. Most of them do not. And then they communicate with myself and the person who's getting the annulment and tell them time to time where they're at with the process, that they've accepted, you know, the initial paperwork. They also require that there be witnesses that send in a statement. So the person usually picks around four people they know that knew them as a couple. I'm talking about the former spouse. They knew them as a couple before they were married especially, but during the marriage as well. And no, they don't go around looking for the person that hates their ex-spouse's guts the most. You know, they just want an honest statement of this is what we observed in their marriage. And it might be as non-threatening as so much as like, did you notice as you socialized with this couple, did they speak to each other and communicate with each other, and you know, those kinds of things too. So they go through that, and they'll get a note saying that the witnesses have all sent in their statements, and then there's a ruling with the tribunal, which I think is composed of several of the people at the diocese, and they're not all. I don't think they're all clergy, but mostly Father. Can't think of his name at the moment, but there's a Father up there that he's the head of the tribunal, and a lot of the communications come from him. I can't think of his name right now. Anyhow, he's a pretty spiritual, understanding person, and so believe it or not, of all the annulments that we've sent in my time here, I've never seen one refused. And he kind of has the attitude that this is not, because they also have to gather their copies of their marriage license, copies of the divorce decree. A lot of paperwork goes into this, and so it's not an easy process. Plus, you're kind of going back through your marriage and how difficult it was, and those are not pleasant memories usually for these people. So they're kind of digging up and digging into their marriage, and it can be kind of painful at times. So his attitude is, if you're willing to go through all that, you know, his personal opinion is, I'm not going to deny you. Having said that, anybody that's considering annulment, I would encourage them to pursue it. I like to think that I'm very helpful in the process. And so in fact, they've actually just changed a lot of the format. So this has become more of a process that involves the deacon or the priest more, in that I would sit down with a couple instead of saying, here's a bunch of questions for you to answer. I would sit down and work through those with them, so that, because many times the things they're asking are like, why are they asking that, and what does that mean? And so I would be there to facilitate that. So I think that will make it even easier.
And then once that annulment is received, then if the person chooses to remarry, then they're married in the Catholic Church.
Yes, then they're free to marry again in the Catholic Church.
Follows again what you're saying.
Right.
What if they are already married civilly?
Then we would probably do a ceremony where a validation, they call it. So we would validate the marriage because it is a civil marriage. So we would validate that marriage and
as a sacramental.
As a sacramental marriage. Yeah.
I didn't understand that when I went through the annulment. I knew I was getting an annulment, but I was already married to a Catholic, and I was becoming Catholic.
Right.
And I was like, well, we've been married for 10 years.
Right. And that brings up a good point, because sometimes in the annulment process, sometimes the children, especially adult children, are the ones who are most upset by the process, because mom or dad come home and say, well, I got my annulment, so I was never married, you know, I wasn't married to my wife, and they're like, well, what does that mean for us? You know, we never had a father or a legal father. No, not at all. The annulment does not annul your civil marriage. That's what divorce is about. And just like divorce, annulment doesn't change that relationship between parents and their children. Annulment only annuls, is only saying that your marriage was not a spiritually valid marriage because of these factors. And but it was still a civil marriage, and that's still binding. And in fact, so I said we want to see the civil decree. We want to see child support and all that stuff, because we certainly don't want to give them the sacramental marriage if they're violating even the civil decree. So, any other questions?
I just wanted to touch on the pre-cana, and my husband and I participated in it over 11 years ago, and a little background with us: we had been together since we were 13. We got engaged when we were 18. We were engaged for 4 years before we got married. We lived together for several years, and we still learned so much about each other in that program. It was very beneficial. Questions that you wouldn't think to ask, and it was really, but it was helpful. You know, you're so busy and you're thinking of planning the wedding and everything, but this really took precedent for us, because it really helped us to understand each other a little bit, and the way that we think and the way that we see the world a little bit. And it was fun. We had a really good time. I mean, I remember being at the retreat and laughing the entire time because we played games, and you know, it was a fun way of learning a little bit about each other. So it's not just another thing to check off, I guess, is what I was
Right, absolutely.
trying to get at.
It's a very important part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I was really encouraged when my stepdaughter went through that with her fiance. I was kind of nervous, and she came home and I said, how was it? And she said, it was great. It really brought up things that needed to be talked about, and it was good.
Mm-hmm.
So I was real happy to hear that too.
Yeah, I think that.
We went in thinking we knew everything about each other, you know, like, what are we going to learn from this? And
Yeah.
we were wrong. So.
I think it's getting better and better, and the diocese put a lot of energy into the program over the last 10 years especially, and so I think it's getting a lot better. You know, the Focus program, interestingly enough, there is an adult, and a married couple version of it.
I was going to say, I would love
Particularly,
Ed says, oh boy.
particularly focused on those who have been married 7 years or longer, I would say.
I would love
It's kind of a good way to, but,
Is that kind of like a checkup?
yeah, a very thorough checkup.
Oh.
So, there's even a section in there on empty nest syndrome, kind of. And so it'll ask questions like, or make statements like, now that our children have left the home, we have discussed how our relationship has changed. You know, anything that leading edge, or not leading edge, but that intimate, I find that most adult males over the age of 30 have a difficulty discussing. So I haven't offered that program here. I have done, once I've done love languages, which I think is kind of focus light. But even there, sometimes we have couples that are like, oh my gosh, you're asking me to say, you know, because it really is. Every marriage has its imperfections. So when you start probing it, you know, my concern is I don't create more damage than good. There's some things that may be painful in a marriage that are best just forget it and move on. But when there are patterns there, then sometimes I think it could be very helpful for the couple to say, love languages is great because it says, I'll make it real simple, but if one of the party, the way they feel that they're loved is that they get compliments from their spouse, if all they're getting all day long is criticisms, how devastating can that be to a person that the very thing that makes them feel loved is the thing being withheld by their spouse? On the other hand, the spouse may be saying, I give her nice gifts all the time, but if that's not what makes her feel loved, it's not doing any good. So he thinks he's loving her, she thinks he's not. And you see why they could end up in a divorce court. It's kind of crazy when it just takes a little simple, but it does take a little work. So when we're in this class, I said, okay, next week your homework is, if that's maybe the situation, then John, I want you to intentionally think about making, say 2 nice things about Mary every day for the next week, and then come back and we'll talk about it. And it's like, oh, okay. But it's hard to change habits, and that's what a lot of those things is.
I think that's really neat though, because it really focuses on the fact that it's a growing relationship and that it will remain faithful through all those stages and all those changes in your life circumstances. So that's a pretty cool resource.
Yeah, I think so. So who knows, maybe I'll try that program here in my old age.
Yeah, there you go. Do you want to take a break at any time?
Yeah, let's take a break right now because I'm
Okay.
just going to move into the clergy.
Okay.